Hello, John Talley here with Partzilla.com, and welcome back to our build series of a 2018 Honda Grom. Today, we're going to be focused in on the suspension. Now, the parts we're going to use is actually two separate part numbers. You've got one that's the complete fork dampener, and it's going to have your compression and your rebound side, along with all the other pieces that you're going to need to get it swapped out on a stock slider and tube. Now, the other piece we're going to be using is a rear shock from Ohlins. It is actually completely adjustable, compression and rebound adjustments on it. Really a nice unit, and it's going to make a huge difference on how this machine handles. Now, the neat thing about this one, when we're through building it, we're actually going to give it away. So if you would check the link in the description below, it'll carry you to a landing page where you can enter to win. But if the contest is already over, why don't you leave us a little note in the comment section and tell us what machine you'd like to see me modify and then us give away. So if you're ready, we'll go dive into this thing. Just to give you an overview of what we're about to do. Now granted, this one's already broken down a pretty good bit, so if you're doing this from the start, you would end up having to remove your seat in the rear tail section. And once you get that out of the way, we're going to have to go a little bit further. There is a lock mount that I need to remove on this side, and then I need to remove, quote, quote, the rear lower fender. Once I get that out of the way, I'll bring over a floor jack, support the machine from the middle, and then we can remove the two bolts and then pop it in there. I figured we'd start on the easy end first, and then we'll deal with the forks later in the day. Let's start with this lower fender first. This just got a few 5mm bolts going through it. The real trick is the other side. I don't think there's enough room to get around the exhaust. We may end up having to pull off the muffler, and then we'll get this lifted out of the way. Oh, grab our spring. So what we'll do is loosen up this and then get the muffler to shift up out of the way. All right, where the seat release lock is, there's a bracket. Screw here, then one up top. They're both Phillips. That should swing out of the way enough for us to get to that top bolt for the shock. There we go. So now we can get to both of them. Let's go ahead and get the jack under there and just support it so it doesn't collapse when we drop them out. That should do it. What you have is a 14 on the bolt side and a 17 on the nut side. And it looks like it's the same thing down low. Let's see if we can pop it loose without having to hold the other side just yet. Yep, look at there. There's one. There's two. Look at your difference here, kids. Completely adjustable, spring rate, compression, rebound, absolutely non-adjustable. All right, let's get it back together. Now we're actually going to put this in upside down so it'll actually clear. Now if this bothers you and you don't want to install it, upside down, they do make one, they being Ohlins, to where it is a remote reservoir, but the reservoir ends up sticking out on the side. I have no problem with installing one of these things upside down, so that's what I'm going to do. There we go. Done with that for now. Now we used the original nuts and bolts that came out of this, and we're going to take it back to the factory spec of 34 foot-pounds for both the bottom one and the top. All right, so the only thing we need to do now is go ahead and remount this holder for the lock switch and then get that lower rear fender remounted. Then reinstall the muffler, and then we get to do the fun part, the front forks. Okay, so the easy part's over with. Let's really dive into those forks now. So what I'm going to do next is take the bike off, spin it around, support the front end, and pull those forks, and then we're going to dive into them. So we're getting ready to drop out the front tire, the caliper, and then we're going to drop out the forks. But before we do any of that, let's go ahead and loosen up our top caps, because they're going to be really hard to hold still in the The clamps are actually doing a great job of that right now, so let's take advantage of that and at least go ahead and break them loose. What I'm doing now is removing the handlebars, because yes, I could grab a large wrench and break those loose, but when I go to put it back together, well, guess what? I've got to torque it back to spec, and you won't be able to do that with a wrench. So we're going to go ahead and drop down our handlebars where we've got easy access to these fork caps. Now, if you want to make sure you get your handlebars back in exactly the right position, go ahead and make a couple of marks and make it easier to line back up when you go to reinstall them. There we go. That'll give us plenty of room to get around there. And these are both 36. All right, good enough. Now let's get that front tire and the caliper off. This one is an ABS unit, so you need to disconnect the speed sensor wire as well. Be careful with it, as they are easily damaged. Also looks like they had red Loctite in there as well, so we'll be adding that back in when we go to reinstall it. A couple of 12s on our caliper. There she goes. Loctite on those too. Next, let's get our axle bolts out. And we should be able to loosen up the clamps. There we go. All right, we've got the right one out. Let's head over to the teardown table and start pulling this thing apart. So I've got it clamped down in our vise. Just have a little towel there to keep it from scratching it up. It doesn't have to be super tight because we're just removing this cap, which is already loosened. And when you're doing this, you want to make sure that your table is clean. All the surfaces you're going to be working on are clean, because you do not want to get any foreign contaminants inside of your forks. All right, next, we're going to grab that and then remove our cap. Whenever I'm taking one of these apart, I just lay them out in order. That way I won't spend so much time running back and forth to the diagram. Now let's go ahead and dump out the oil and pump it out. When you're doing this, you do not want to pull all the way out on the lower fork tube, because we actually are going to leave this together. There's no real reason for us to pull the seals out, because that's not what we're after. We're going to let it hang here and finish draining. While it's doing that, I'm going to go ahead and remove the other fork and just lay it to the side. Hopefully this thing will be through, and then we'll continue taking it apart. Right, Ohlins makes a special tool to hold this, and what you're basically doing is creating a clamp, and it's actually putting a protrusion inside of one of these holes to hold it still. Well, I didn't buy that tool. What I did do is I already had a 31 millimeter seal driver. All I did was just drill a hole in it and then put an 8 millimeter pin through it. Now there is a little bit of a rough edge on this tool, so what we're going to do is wrap it with a piece of paper, because we're not actually clamping down on the tube. We're just holding this pin into one of those holes. That's all we're trying to accomplish. And when I place it up in there, I'll drop it down, put it in the vise, and that should hold it still. Now, just so all that doesn't fall apart, I'm actually going to tape it together. One modified special tool. That should do. Now the fun begins. I'm going to go grab a heat gun, bring this up to around 200 degrees, and what we're trying to do is break down the Loctite that's inside of this particular connection. But here's the real important part. This is a reverse thread, so we're actually going to turn this clockwise to loosen it. So 185, 184. Let's give it a shot. Yeah, resist the temptation to just grab this with your bare hands. You won't be happy. Keep in mind that tube's going to be pretty hot as well. While all that Loctite is still warm, let's go ahead and wipe it out of the bottom part. Ooh, still warm. All right, next, let's go ahead and get this end cap off, and this is a 14 millimeter. All right, these last couple of threads, you want to get your hand near it, because the spring's going to try to kick it out, and the washer. Not a lot of pressure, but just be ready for it. There we go. Cap, our washer. All right, let's go ahead and get this out of the clamp so we can get the dampening rod out of it. That worked well. There we go. That's what we were after. So we've got everything fully disassembled now, but there are a couple of pieces that we need to take off the stock dampener rod and transfer them over to the new one from Ohlins. Now the one we're going to start with is going to be the rebound side. And you can tell we're on the rebound side because this little ring right here, this is actually called a piston ring, and the flat side is forced up against this end of the dampener. And we're actually going to take it off and transfer it over to our rebound side of our new Ohlins part. And you know this is the rebound side, one, because it was marked inside the packaging, and plus I put an R on it. But if you took it out of the packaging and you got mixed up as to which one's which, you can tell because your spring is on the bottom side of this holder. So to take off this piston ring, we just want to carefully expand it just enough to get off of the old dampener rod, and then we're going to reinstall it onto the Ohlins piece. The other piece that we're going to transfer over is this return spring, and that is all we will need off of this particular piece. So let's put this dampener rod back into our fork tube. Next, we're going to put in the springs, and I've decided to go with the heavier of the two. They send it with a 5.5 and a 6. We're going to go with the 6.0. I'm guessing the person that's going to win this is about my size, so we're going to go with the larger one. Okay, at this point, we need to reattach our tool and then clamp it back in the vise. Critical that you get this lined up correctly. All right, once again, let's tape these two halves together so they don't fall off as we get it in the vise. So now we put in a couple of new pieces. We have a washer and a spacer that came with the kit. And now we reinstall the bottom cap, make sure there's some oil or either grease on this O-ring as we put this in. And we're going to take this to 40 Newton meters or 29.5 foot-pounds. Now let's take it out of the vise and start working on the other end. Next, let's grab our circlip and get it put in place. See how strong my fingers are here. Now we'll just slide it down and slip it into that groove. There we go. So with our circlip on, we take the Ohlins washer, and you want the chamfered side facing toward the circlip, of course. Then you take the rubber bump that was in the old top cap, insert it into the new Ohlins one, put that in place. Then we'll take the crush washer and the Ohlins bolt, apply a little bit of Loctite, insert it, and then we're going to tighten that to 15 Newton meters. There we go. Next, let's go ahead and get it back into the vise, and then we're going to fill it up with 235 milliliters of fork oil. And I'm actually using some 5-weight from Maxima, but if you wanted to use the Ohlins, we carry that as well, so it's really up to you which one you want to go with. I've always had good luck with this particular brand, so that's what I'm going to go with. And as we're pouring it, you want to work the valve up and down to get air out and fluid in, otherwise it's not going to take it, it'll just spill out the top. So just keep that in mind as you're pouring it in. So let's get a little bit of grease on this O-ring, and then we can put this cap on. Now we won't do our final torque until we actually get it back on the machine where the machine is actually holding it in the clamps, and that's when it'll get tightened all the way. But right now we just need to seal it back up. Now let's get it out of its vise. And what we're going to do next is get a little bit of Loctite. We're going to run it lightly around the threads, get this on, clamp it into the vise, and then torque it down. Now here's the real trick. Up to this point, I've been using a standard 14. You need to make sure that you have one that extends out at least 2 1/4 to 2.5 inches, which I just happen to have. And guess what? We'll be through with this fork. So here's the only thing that's different from one fork to the other. The compression, you can see that the spring's on the opposite side of this channel, and that is the direction that we want these protrusions to face. So regardless of what you took off as far as the direction of the factory dampening rods. This is the way the Ohlins is set up. You want to make sure it's always pointing, no matter which side you're talking about, toward that little spring right there. If you've got that with the protrusions pointing that direction, you've got it. So let's get these things installed. Be careful bringing them in, not to scratch them. Bring it just maybe a millimeter above the edge, right there. We're just gonna snug them down for the time being, then we'll come back and actually set the torque. Each one of the pinch bolts gets torqued to 27 Newton meters or 20 foot-pounds. And then when you're doing these, especially the bottom ones, do one, then the other, and then go back and check that first one. Make sure it's still at the same torque value. And let's go back. See? Had to go back and then bring it a little bit more because that other one had pulled it down and gave it a false reading the first time around. All right, let's jump over and do the other side. Now, with those tightened down, let's hit those top caps. This is going to be 30 Newton meters or 22 foot-pounds. There we go. Let's get our clamps put back together. If you remember correctly at the beginning of this, I made a little small dot to show the correct position. The other dot you need to pay attention to is the top part of the clamp. You want that facing forward, and that is also the end that gets tightened down first. We tighten this one down and then go to the back one. Now we will be taking these back off later when we start working on the air-fuel management system, because there's actually going to be an air-fuel ratio gauge that's going to get mounted there, a readout for it, but we'll put it back together for the time being. Now just need to get the front tire on, then the caliper, and then the fender, and we're pretty much done with this. And we're going to take that front nut to 40 foot-pounds. There we go. Let's prep our bolts for the brake caliper bracket, and we're also going to put a little dab of red Loctite. And then once we get it on, we're going to take it to 22 foot-pounds. Just pushing our caliper pistons back so it'll be easier to wiggle it on the rotor. Next, let's go ahead and get our speed sensor and that associated cable holder in place. Now let's carefully slide our fender back into place. Well, all right, guys, that pretty much wraps this one up. But as you can tell, I still have some work to do. So if you'd like to be notified when that happens, why don't you go ahead and subscribe. Listen, if the contest is still going on, why don't you check the link in the description below. That way you can enter to win this. But take heart, if the contest is over, why don't you leave us a comment telling us what machine you'd like to see me modify next. Listen, we just want to say thank you for shopping here with us at Partzilla, and we will see you in the next video. Y'all have a great day.